Hi everyone, welcome to our Poolside Proficiency webinar series. We're excited to be here with you to talk about the basics of a proficiency-driven language program. Before we get started, let's go through a couple of housekeeping items. Your microphones are muted, so we don't have to worry about any background noise or static. If you have a question, please type in the question box. We will be monitoring it throughout the webinar. You can actually go ahead right now and tell us what you hope to get out of this webinar, or let us know early if you have something that you would definitely like us to cover. You can also send us questions on Twitter using the hashtag Poolside Proficiency. Also use this hashtag if you hear something great during this webinar and you'd like to share it with your professional learning network on Twitter. In case you encounter any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat and we will try to troubleshoot for you. If you'd like to contact us directly, you can email listening@waysidepublishing.com. Today's webinar will be about an hour long, with Kristen and Jay presenting for about 30 minutes and leaving us plenty of time at the end for your questions. Let me introduce our presenters. Kristen Blees has been a Spanish and English teacher for over 20 years. In those years, she has taught in Texas, Minnesota, and Colorado. In addition to teaching, she was a district world language coordinator and president of the CCFLT. She's also had opportunities to teach and do teacher training abroad with Fulbright, the US Peace Corps, and the State Department's English language programs. Jay's language journey started in 6th grade when he started learning Spanish and French, and it has taken him many places and into a variety of roles. He was a French teacher for 14 years, a district level coordinator, and a state supervisor for languages, and vice president of the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages. He has worked as a translator and an interpreter, and he's currently the manager of instructional development at Wayside. Jay?
Thank you, Jofi. If you are, just to start off, if your department or your district is teaching for proficiency or making the transition to teach for proficiency, we feel the program really needs to have all of the following qualities and characteristics. And these are the sorts of things we're going to be talking about in our time together today. First and foremost, it should be fully aligned to the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning, the proficiency guidelines, performance descriptors, and can-do statements. And interculturality is also important.
So true, Jay. Interculturality is kind of a new concept, and many teachers may not quite understand what it is. So we'll go into that more a little bit later. I think it's also critical that any proficiency-based program use principles of backward design so that teachers identify what they want students to be able to do with the language and how they'll get there, as well as assess with performance-based assessments and teach vocabulary and grammar in context. And of course, the most important part of a proficiency-based program is all of you joining us today, teachers who strive to teach for proficiency. So let's dive in and look at each of these topics a little more in depth.
Any proficiency-driven program, first and foremost, has to be aligned to all the right things. A textbook that's truly proficiency-based and standards-aligned is critically important. We have all of these foundational documents and so much research and work behind them, so it's important that when materials are created for the language classroom that they use those as a bedrock foundation.
Let's talk a little bit about those documents. So to help students develop proficiency, it's important that your program is aligned with the World Readiness Standards and focus on those 5 C's that we have. It must also take those actual proficiency guidelines and performance descriptors into account when creating the tasks we're asking students to do. And a good language program should have the necessary, actful, communicative, and intercultural can-do statements embedded throughout. So students can set goals and self-assess their progress as language learners, both communicatively in the 3 modes, as well as interculturally by investigating and interacting in the language.
So speaking of standards and foundational documents, let's take a minute to talk about the 5 goal areas of the 5 C's. The first of the 5 C's is communication. So let's look at each of the 3 different modes. And first, in the interpretive mode of communication, Students interact with resources as a way to deepen their knowledge of vocabulary, grammar, and culture, and to increase their overall communicative ability. Here we can see a few examples of authentic resources in both French and Spanish that can be used for interpretive tasks and then spun out into the other modes. One of these resources is a video, so I'd like for us to take a minute and watch a clip.
En el colegio es como si los indígenas nos sentíamos rechazados por nuestra vestimenta. Y acá ya venimos a como aprender nuestro idioma natal. Ali punja, li. Me siento muy bien porque
As we can see with those examples, Jay, authentic resources are so great to use in the classroom because they create a greater level of interest and engagement over teacher-created or textbook-created resources and activities. Students are engaging with real language and real culture by working with print, audio, video resources created by native speakers for native speakers.
I definitely remember when I was in the classroom spending hours, literally hours, evenings and weekends on trying to find my own authentic resources. And I know a lot of teachers can relate to that. And in fact, looking for authentic resources, I've always thought can be kind of a trap because it's the ultimate procrastination tool. You get to feel productive because you're looking for all these resources, but you're not getting the grading done, for example, that you know you have to get done. So a good proficiency-driven program has lots of activities based on authentic resources, so teachers can spend less time looking for them on their own.
That's a really good point, Jay. I think we've all gotten lost in the internet looking for that perfect resource. However, we can get more use from the resources if we also use them in the interpersonal mode as a springboard for conversations. In real life, we communicate in the interpersonal mode to share and to get new information. And it's important that interpersonal tasks in the classroom do the same thing. The prompts we as teachers provide for our students need to give them a reason to have a conversation other than to just practice the language. In order to build proficiency, learners have to have a purpose to communicate. They need to have opportunities to exchange information that reflect real-world contexts.
And then once students carry out an interpersonal task, they can move into the presentational mode to create and present products to extend their learning.
Exactly. Like you see here in these examples. In the one on the left, students are writing a description about a community event to promote healthy living that they are planning. In the middle example, students are creating a video application for a scholarship to help cover study abroad costs. And on the right, students are designing an infographic about the climate and appropriate clothing for a specific destination that they'd like to visit. You can tell with these examples that students are using the language in a way they might use it outside of the classroom.
And moving on to the next goal area of the 5 C's, cultures, where students use the language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the 3 P's, the products, practices, and perspectives, and their relationship to each other. So in the example on the left here, you can see students are looking at the 3 P's in relation to a Rwandan market. And on the right, Spanish students are beginning to look at the Dominican population, both in the Dominican Republic and right here in the United States.
And here, Jay, we have a great example of how other content areas can be integrated in a grammar lesson to meet the connections standard. While looking at how to talk about the weather, we could use this infographic that explains how altitude affects the climate and crops in Colombia. The altitude is presented in meters and the temperatures in Celsius, so we can work in some of that math with the conversions to feet and Fahrenheit. And geography can come in when we look at how that affects the culture, as in what types of food are grown and eaten in that country.
Visuals, visuals, visuals. Use of imagery is great for making comparisons, especially in the target language. So on the page on the left here, students are comparing products from the Dominican Republic and New York. Using an American state as a familiar reference point, learners are comparing cultural products from the 2 places. And on the right, during a vocab lesson, students are making comparisons between meals at a cafe, restaurant, and at home in France and Rwanda. And of course, while they're comparing what is being eaten in these two countries, they naturally begin to compare it to what they personally eat as well, all in the target language. And the final of the 5 C's is communities. Here we have an example of a project where learners take what they've learned about dominoes and how much of a part of the culture it is in places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic, and then plan a domino event for students and members of the larger community, potentially reaching out to those of other generations as well. And these types of projects allow students to take their learning beyond the 4 walls of the classroom.
You know, language teaching looks a lot different than it did when I was studying to become a language teacher. This shift to proficiency-driven classes has really made us change our focus from teaching students about the language to really helping them learn to use it.
Yeah, definitely. And ACTFL has given us so many recommendations, white papers, position statements on how to do that. So let's now look at some key features of a proficiency-driven language program. First, it's important to take a minute and talk about the difference between performance and proficiency in order to understand how they relate to each other. When we're talking about the language classroom, we're talking about performance. And that's why we use terms like performance assessment. Performance is a learner's ability to use learned and practice language in an instructional setting which is connected to curriculum. That's what we as teachers are assessing, and that's what we're coaching in students.
And all of those performance-based tasks that you are talking about, Jay, are what help to build our students' proficiency. So then what exactly is proficiency? Well, proficiency is the ability to use language in real-world situations, meaning spontaneous interactions or interactions that are not rehearsed. The kind of interactions we have all the time in our native language throughout the course of a day. In conjunction with interculturality, it is defined as the ability of an individual to use culturally appropriate language to communicate spontaneously in unrehearsed contexts and in a way that's acceptable and appropriate to native speakers of the language.
And students' ability to communicate then really depends on performance, both in the receptive and the productive modes. So it's important to let your learners know that they're not expected to understand, nor can they understand everything that they hear, read, or see. And their ability to speak and write in the language will increase over time.
It's a good idea to take some time in those first few days of the school year to discuss this with your students. There are a couple of great resources online to help facilitate this beginning of the year type of activity.
Yeah, I used to always do that with my students, discuss this sort of thing with them early on in the school year. And this is something that many people have probably or maybe seen before. This is a poster from Alyssa Villarreal. It's a great way to illustrate to students that language learning is a path and that language learning takes time. Talk about, for instance, if you were using this with your students, talk about how by the end of level 1, students can expect to be at a novice high proficiency level, even though their performances may seem higher. Again, remember, we're thinking about the difference between proficiency and performance. And then at the end of level 2, they'll get to intermediate low and to intermediate mid by the end of level 3.
And to help the students understand what the different proficiency levels actually look and sound like, have them do this activity created by Kara Parker. Divide the class into 6 groups, and each group will get one of those cards you see on the screen. Each card explains one of the proficiency levels, novice low through intermediate high. Then give them a topic in English and have them describe it according to how their card says to. You can see the examples from Kara's classroom in the picture where her students described a circus.
Yeah, those are great ideas, and all of them would help definitely help students start to understand that language learning isn't about passing tests, but about how well one can communicate in the language.
Another key feature to look for in a proficiency-based program is how interculturality is integrated into it.
Yeah, so I know that when we teach culture, we always talk about the 3 Ps, the products, practices, and perspectives of the target culture. But can you just sort of elaborate a little more on what interculturality is, how it's different from that?
Sure. Interculturality takes into account those 3 Ps, But rather than treating them in isolation, students demonstrate their understanding of them through how they communicate in the target language and interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds, using authentic language appropriately. And we get to this point by incorporating the World Readiness Standards, those 5 C's, and through the 3 modes of communication, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, so that learners can know themselves, explore communities, both theirs and others, and engage with the world, all in order to arrive at interculturality, or that I in the middle. Look for programs that don't treat culture as an optional drop-in trivia that is addressed if and when you have time for it in class. Rather, interculturality should be intentionally woven into the goals of each unit, the resources, their authenticity, the formative and summative assessments, and student self-assessment as well. As a result, interculturality is considered integral to student progression along the proficiency continuum.
Another one of the features of a language program that has a really, really big impact on students is any kind of interaction with native speakers. Here we have an example of a video blogger. She's a teenager, much like many of your students are, and she's a native speaker of French from Togo. So now, as students watch her and learn about her life, they're not going to understand every word that she says, nor do they need to, but they will get a true representation of the language's natural rate of speech and vocabulary that she uses.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Kate. J'ai 11 ans et demi. Je suis née le 2 juin 2006 au Togo. Je suis la seule fille pour mes parents. Voici ma famille, voici ma mère et mon père. Et me voici au milieu.
These video bloggers are an effective way for students to hear the language come alive and also to get exposure to the culture that they are learning about.
When we're talking about moving from teaching about the language to teaching students to use the language, it changes so much of what we do. So I think this quote really works well with explaining why the shift is important, because learning about a language is good, but it doesn't do the students any good until they learn how to use it. Just like paint sitting in a can doesn't do any good. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with backward design, or at least have heard of it. Using backward design to plan your units and lesson will help ensure that your students are applying their knowledge and they're not just letting it sit in the can.
Exactly. Backward design rests on the premise that when planning, teachers begin with the end in mind and have a clear understanding of the destination. In other words, what you want students to know and be able to do with what they learn. A language program using backward design will begin by identifying themes and subthemes. In this level 1 French example, we're looking at Unit 1, talking about identity, who we are, and what we like to do. It is clearly outlined what learners will be able to do by the end of their study of this unit, and what the evidence of the knowledge would look like. Out of these themes, we come up with the essential questions, the unit goals, can-do statements, and then the summative assessment.
Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an attendee in listen.
Let's go back and look at those can-do statements for a minute, because if we're talking proficiency, we also really need to talk about the role of can-do statements in language learning, because can-do statements are powerful tools to bring intentionality to planning for learning and planning for instruction. So Ali Moeller, Ruta Coué, Jackie Van Houten, Helen Small, they've all been key players in researching and bringing can-do learning to the American language classroom. In an ideal proficiency-based program, can-do statements are embedded throughout the units, and there are both communicative can-dos and intercultural can-dos. They address specific skills, vocabulary, language structures, functions, and cultural knowledge needed to answer the essential questions and achieve unit goals.
And can-do statements are also great for helping students set goals in their language learning and to gain a better understanding of proficiency and their own path to proficiency. Beyond goal setting, can-do statements are an important reflection tool. They're not a checklist, and students should not approach them as a one and done to do. They're supposed to really invite reflection on the part of the student, and the student's documenting of evidence of having met a particular can-do statement is the result. So not only can can-do statements help teachers understand what they might teach both communicatively and interculturally, they help students understand the broader scope of their language learning and to see concretely what they can do in the language. Jay, both you and I believe strongly in effective use of formative assessment to gauge learning, especially if our goal is to have our students communicate. Embedded formative assessments provide feedback on how well students are progressing in meeting unit goals. It's essential to have opportunities for providing daily feedback that are interspersed throughout the unit via the various activities and steps aligned with the can-do statements.
When teaching for proficiency, it's also critical that we assess learning using performance-based assessments. So in these examples in Spanish and French, summative assessments are integrated performance assessments, IPAs, where students use the language and the different modes of communication. And like any strong IPA, there's a real-world context with a situation or problem to address. Students are then given print, audio, or video input through the interpretive mode, which they process and react to. Then they engage in an interpersonal speaking or writing task, followed by a presentational task, again, speaking or writing.
You know, Jay, I noticed that when I started using IPAs to assess my students, they really seemed to grasp the idea that it wasn't about getting a question right or wrong on a test, but rather taking what they know and actually using it. Students stopped asking me how many words they were supposed to write on an essay or how long they were supposed to talk. They knew the answer was going to be, show me what you know. And you know what? They would. It was empowering for them to be able to understand and be understood. And it was exciting for me as the teacher to see them communicate at whatever their proficiency level was.
We as language teachers, we want our students to be able to use the language they're studying. That's the whole point. But we all know that traditional teaching doesn't always lead to that. We've learned that just having students memorize vocab and grammar rules and then doing rote type activities doesn't accomplish this goal. It gets them nowhere near language acquisition. And Bill Van Patten really hit the nail on the head when he said that becoming proficient in a second language only develops in one way, and that's through engaging in communication.
You're exactly right, Jay. And I think another important part of his quote here is that he points out we can't drill our way to proficiency, but rather we need to be in situations that require us to communicate or have a need to use the language. Learning vocabulary is so much more than just memorizing a list of words. We want students to really acquire the words in a way that they can actually communicate them, not just repeat them like parrots.
Totally. Teaching vocabulary in context is a great way and actually one of the best ways to help students do exactly that, because they can see or hear how the new words are used in the language and then start to use them themselves for real world communication.
I agree, totally. It's always important to provide some good comprehensible input with the new vocabulary before asking students to use it. Move them from the receptive mode to the productive mode, so from comprehensible input to output. It's also a good idea to present the vocabulary in smaller chunks that students will immediately interact with. This will help them to acquire the language as opposed to sitting down with their vocabulary list or their stack of flashcards to just memorize the new words.
Yeah, it really does make sense to have students exposed to the language in various contexts and then use it immediately for communicating with a real purpose. And here's an example at the novice level of what we're talking about. So the vocabulary being presented here are words that identify who someone is. And there are a couple of activities that allow students to hear the words being used in various contexts. Then after they've gotten that input, kind of like what you were just saying, Kristen, they're then asked to start to communicate with the new words. And we can see in activity 4 here that students are going to interview various classmates to find out what words they would use to identify themselves. So they're using the new vocabulary to learn new information about their classmates.
That's such a great novice level example, Jay, because at the novice mid-level, students are able to use some isolated words and memorize phrases, which is what this task is asking them to do.
We just talked about teaching vocabulary in context, and we need to be doing the same thing with grammar. We need to be teaching grammar in context using an inductive approach. So just like the vocabulary, this approach allows students to see how and why a native speaker would use the language and start to make those connections and figure out how the language works. We as teachers, we don't need to be the providers of all knowledge, nor should we. We should be creating a discursive community in our classroom where students are discovering the language they're learning. We can guide the students and help co-construct that knowledge, but they should be the ones who make the discovery and create and understand meaning.
And ACTFL agrees with that, saying that when it's the students who are doing the exploring and discovering of how the grammar concepts work, they're the ones who are going to be able to communicate using it at a higher level. There are various inductive approaches to teaching grammar, such as the PACE model or the concept attainment one. But the one that I want to point out today is called discovery process, and there are 5 steps to it. The first step is to have students see the language in context and to process it for meaning. At this point, they're not even thinking about the grammar, just the message of the text. Next, the teacher will point out the targeted grammar structure as it's used in that text that the students just looked at. At this point, the teacher can provide a few guiding questions to focus the students as they make some predictions about how and why that grammar structure is used in that context. Now, students need to see if their predictions actually hold water, and they need to test them. So the teacher will provide more input or more examples of that structure and context so students can test their hypothesis and revise it if necessary. Once they have an understanding of how and why that grammar structure is used, then they're ready to start using it to communicate.
So everything you were just saying reminded me of the quote from Bill Van Patten that we saw a little while ago about engaging in meaningful communication and having a purpose to communicate. And it also goes back to that saying, be a guide on the side and not the sage on the stage. So could you kind of walk us through what the discovery process might look like in a lesson?
Sure, no problem. So here we have an example from a unit for true novices in Spanish. Our grammar target structure is the verb to be in the singular forms. Thinking about backward design when planning this unit, we know that the students will need to be able to identify themselves and ask about others' identities as well. The grammar structure was actually first introduced in the vocabulary section, as you can see here. Students learned that soy means I am, but they didn't know that it was the first person singular, the verb ser, which is an irregular verb, blah, blah, blah. They just knew that soy means I am. Now we get to the grammar section, which is called observa, and there's a little conversation between 2 students here. The teacher can ask a few comprehension questions to make sure that their students understand that conversation. And then the teacher can point out the structures. In this case, eres and soy. Then, with a guiding question or 2, the students will use this think, pair, share graphic organizer and make a prediction about how those words were being used. Once they have their predictions, they test them against some more input. That input can be in various forms, but I'm going to use this Observa video that gives more examples of the language in use as an animated teacher walks them through testing their hypothesis. Let's watch a quick clip of this video.
Use a check mark to indicate the person is bilingual, an athlete, or an artist, and an X to indicate they are not. If you're not sure, write a question mark.
Soy bilingüe. Hablo inglés y español. ¿Y tú, eres bilingüe?
Sí, soy bilingüe también. ¿Eres atleta?
Sí, Soy futbolista. Me gusta jugar fútbol. ¿Y tú, eres artista?
Yo no, no soy artista. Paul es artista.
So the video goes on with the teacher asking some guiding questions about the grammar the students use in their conversation and giving more input. And then by the end of this step, students are usually ready to start communicating using the structures.
And again, like I mentioned Bill Van Patten earlier, I'll mention him again because I noticed that these activities follow exactly his recommendation and what he said in that earlier quote. They're definitely not your typical first grammar activities like filling in verb boxes or conjugating verbs in isolation.
Yep, these activities allow the students to use what they just learned in a communicative activity where they are sharing and getting new information.
So this idea and everything, all the other ones we discussed today are definitely a step in the right direction for teachers who are looking to teach for proficiency or departments who are looking to move into that direction. I think that we have some questions. I'm going to kick it back over to Jofi, and we will be happy to answer questions.
Yes, now is a great time to type in your questions into the question box or into the chat, and we'll get right to them. We have a comment saying that Luz Maria hoped to learn more ways to get the students to talk. So Jay and Kristen, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to get students to talk in the classroom.
Kristen, you want to toss out a strategy that works for you when you were a teacher?
Sure. I think, really providing that comprehensible input up front for them so that they can hear how it's used will help build their confidence, and just really encouraging them and allowing them to take risks. I think it's important that we don't jump on every mistake they make. I know when I was teaching, even though in my teacher ears, I heard mistakes that were like fingernails on chalkboard, I didn't correct my students immediately all the time because I wanted them to be comfortable in expressing themselves. So I think that's important when we're doing any type of speaking activity, is just to allow students to take those risks and attempt communicating in the language with the way they can. Do you have any other ideas, Jay?
Well, I always just say keep it relevant. I mean, and that's why I think real world tasks and activities are so important. Human beings have language because we need to communicate. We have things we have to share and want to share with other members of the human race. And the more relevant we're dealing with the content in students' lives, the more reason they have to speak in the target language, the more reason they have to use the language that we're using in class or use the input that we're providing them. And there are all sorts of resources also that people can find online about teaching in the target language and tasks and activities that students can do.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jay and Kristen. We have a question from Ulysses Ramos. So he's asking, what about using the target language? ACTFL recommends teachers to use 90% of the target language in the classroom. What is your view in regards to the usage of the target language and linking it to a textbook like EntreCulturas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I forget what Ulysses' language was in terms of maybe what we do, but I would say it was stronger. It's our profound belief that teachers and students should be using the target language in the classroom. And that 90% number, that's not a magic number. That's just something ACTFL pulled out. I believe in maximizing as much as possible. If you can go beyond 90%, go beyond 90%. So what EntreCulturas and EntreCultures do from the start is they support teachers using the target language with comprehensible input and students producing in the language based on that input. That's something we believe very strongly with. So we do that with scaffolded activities, with visuals that support comprehension and scaffold comprehension. We rely on teachers to use all those tools they have in their toolbox anyway, in terms of gestures and all kinds of props and things to, again, scaffold comprehension. But target language use, both on the part of teachers and students, is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I know it is to Kristen as well, and it's something that we believe very, very strongly in with our products, because again, we are about communication. We're about students learning languages and using them. We're not about having them sit through course credits, ticking it off, passing a test and getting credit. If at the end of the time they can't communicate, then we haven't done our job in any fashion as teachers.
Jay, you mentioned a lot of the supports that we have in our textbooks, such as the graphics, the images, the infographics, the charts, etc. There's also a great resource for teachers to help support them in using the target language. In the appendix, I believe in the Spanish book, it's Appendix F, there is a whole list of instructional strategies that teachers can use to help stay in the target language and help keep their students in the target language. And that's organized by units. So for a lot of the activities in each of the units, you're going to see additional suggestions in addition to the red teacher notes in the teacher edition, but you'll see additional ideas on how to do those activities and to really increase and promote that target language use.
Exactly.
Our next question is from Jessica, and her question is, what type of this series? We are looking at adopting this for our advanced learners. I'm looking at using mastery, approaching mastery, grading versus ABC. What are you doing? What do you recommend?
Go ahead,
I'm a strong component of proficiency-based grading, and our textbooks will support that through all the different rubrics we provide. All of our rubrics are aligned with those ACTFL proficiency guidelines and performance descriptors. And so the students clearly know what they need to do to meet expectations and to move toward that next proficiency level. We provide both analytic and holistic rubrics in all the modes of communications that you can use for the formative assessments or any of the activities. For the IPAs, those summative assessments, we have analytic rubrics that are specifically created for those assessments. And in the French series that is just coming out, we actually have included single point rubrics, which are a really cool new take on rubrics. So you might want to check those out as well. Did you have something else to add, Jay?
No, I was going to say everything you said and said that the series definitely supports grading in that fashion.
Jessica Palmer is asking, how can this curriculum be adapted for native speakers?
Kristen, if you have examples of teachers using EntreCulturas or EntreCultures with native level speakers, the levels 1 through 3, for instance?
I know I've talked with teachers who use EntreCulturas with their native students, and they usually start their Heritage Speaker 1 class in the level 3 textbook of EntreCulturas, and then for the next year they would move into the pre-AP book, which is currently our Tejidos book, and we will be having a EntreCulturas 4 book that is coming out as well. And starting in level 3 and in quite a bit of level 2, the book is entirely in Spanish, so that it will challenge your heritage speakers to improve their vocabulary and grammar knowledge, as well as their literacy.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. We have a question from Jen. She's saying, my community includes some vocal parents who are wary of proficiency anything because they are unfamiliar with it. How do I convey the benefits to them or get their buy-in in general?
Can I take that one, Kristen?
Sure, go for it.
So this is a question that I've gotten a lot in my time working in languages. And I think that parents who are asking this have typically had very disappointing language learning experiences themselves. I would say that virtually all of them who asked that kind of question would be also people who said, and we've all heard it so many times before, but people who say, well, I took 4 years of French in college, I can't speak a word, or I took 4 years of German, whatever language, can't speak a word. And that's exactly the point. They don't want their own children to have that experience. If their children are having seat time in a class, they want their children to learn. And that's why proficiency and communication is so important to us. I always say we would never, as a society, we would never accept it. if we put kids through 12 years of math and then at the end of that didn't expect them to be able to do any math. And the same is true with language. If we're going to have students learning languages, then we want them to be able to communicate in languages. And I think that's a message that always resonates with parents. And parents are one of your most valuable stakeholders in terms of expanding an existing program or building new ones, because they're the ones who have the most vested interest in the language learning opportunities or any opportunities, learning opportunities of kids in the community.
I like your example of comparing learning languages with math and the expectations, because that connection is not often made. And it's just like learning anything, right? If you put your kids in swim lessons and they're standing on the pool deck for the entire swim lesson, you're going to be wondering, why are they not getting in the water to learn how to swim? And a proficiency-based program is really similar. We need students to be immersed in the language, using the language, so that their proficiency does grow.
Our next question is from Virginia. She has a comment about inductive grammar. She said, the students don't know how English grammar works. What have you done to facilitate the transfer so that the produced language is the target language and not franglais or Spanglish?
So that's really, Virginia, that's like the heart of the discovery approach for us. Students don't know the English grammar, and that's kind of the point. We're not interested in transferring. What's happening is that there's not a transfer of grammar. It's not a transfer of English grammar to French or to Spanish. It's that students construct and make meaning of what they're observing and identifying in the way we approach it. And you saw in that video with the Spanish verb ser, where the two students were describing themselves, and they were using soy and eres. And the point is that students are able to look at that, hypothesize of what that meaning is, understand that the to form is eres and the yo form is soy, and they can begin understanding what that means in that context and communicate with it. They get the other forms later as they need, but what they're given in terms of grammar and vocabulary is what they need to actually communicate. And so that's exactly the value of that approach. Because the traditional method of explicit grammar does rely on that transfer. It's like, oh, let's see, in English you say something this way, how do you say it in French? And you get all sorts of linguistic interference as a learner, which inhibits acquisition.
Yeah, if I add anything to that, Jay, I'll probably just reiterate what you said. But it goes back to providing them the input so they can see it being used. If that input is comprehensible and they understand how and why the grammar is being used, then you create the tasks that are at the correct proficiency level for them to be able to use it. Exactly. And as Jay said, as you said, Jay, you don't need to introduce everything about that grammar point up front at the beginning. They'll learn all of it eventually, but if you take it in smaller chunks, they will be able to acquire instead of just having to try to memorize the rules.
We have a quick question from Deborah. She said, I like some of these examples. Can you share them after the webinar? And I can quickly answer that all of these examples are from our EntreCulturas and EntreCultures series. And you can sign up for a learning site sample to get a free 30-day access, including the teacher resources. And we also have a lot of great resources on our new blog, Proficiency Talks, which you can find at proficiencytalks.com. We have time for a couple more questions. So Sylvia asks, do you have any thoughts on how to involve students in taking on these proficiency-based strategies?
I'll answer this one, Jay. We did mention those two activities from Alyssa Villarreal and Kara Parker that you can use at the beginning of the school year to really start to explain that it is a path and it's not a matter of overnight success. It's going to take a while, and then explaining, what the different levels look and sound like. And I would also recommend that you take those proficiency descriptors and create little mini posters and post those on the walls of your classroom, and that you refer to them often with your students when talking about the activities you're doing and their next steps, so that they just kind of naturally are thinking about those different levels.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for people who are not familiar with the performance descriptors, what those are is they are examples of real world applications of language, which also kind of connect in concept to can-do statements. And I was going to piggyback on what you said, Kristen, to also say that can-do statements can be leveraged in that way as well. And Kristen made a good point earlier saying they're not a checklist and they should never be approached as a checklist, but they are a really useful tool for goal setting and for students to see what is involved in the proficiency continuum of a given language by looking at what some of those breakdown goals are, both communicatively and interculturally.
Our next question is from Marco, and he says, I struggle with really explaining how culture and interculturality differ to my students. Any thoughts on how to simplify that distinction?
You want me to take this one, Jay?
Yeah, you basically covered it in that slide. So yeah, I think it would be great to reiterate that because it is important information. So I'm glad Marco asked the question.
Yeah, so culture, as we mentioned before, is really knowing about the products of that group of people. So the products are things they use in their daily life, their practices, what they do, how they use the products, and their perspectives, the why behind all of that. So that's learning the culture. They're kind of almost facts about that group of people. Whereas interculturality is still about knowing that information, knowing about the products, practices, and perspectives, but it's moving more toward using the target language to show that knowledge. So showing your knowledge of the culture by how you communicate, using language appropriately with the native speakers you are speaking to, being able to understand their point of view, even if you don't agree with it, but being able to understand their perspective on the topic because of your knowledge of the culture. I hope that answers your point.
And being able to pause and withhold judgment too when students come up against something that in another culture that feels different, to them. And really, the updated, necessful, actful, intercultural can-do statements get to that as well. Kristen, you mentioned using the target language and interacting in culturally appropriate ways with appropriate language in real-world contexts and situations. The updated intercultural can-dos, they move beyond. There's still the investigate piece, the learning about those 3 Ps, but it goes further to interact. And it's that interaction that really is, I believe, the 21st century skill.
We have another comment from Jessica. She said, this is great. I've been sitting here cheering. How do I get buy-in from colleagues?
Well, Jessica, we would never let students go 12 years in math and not be able to do any math. I understand that it does, and teaching for proficiency does involve some true instructional shifts and some real challenges, and buy-in can be difficult at times. I would say, without knowing your teachers and without knowing your department, that any language teacher at their heart wants their classroom to be a place that is of high value to their students and highly valued. And for that to have high value, students need to be able to learn to communicate in the language and carry themselves with intercultural competence. And for your program to be valued, people need to see that students leave your programs being able to communicate at a certain proficiency level in the language, whether that be the learners themselves, their parents, your administrators, both building level and district level. It really is the direction that all language learning is going, and it's the best thing teachers can do for themselves and their learners is to really focus on teaching for proficiency. It's not always easy. I always say start small. So if you can find areas of collaboration with your department where you are in agreement about certain points, start there and try to be as collaborative and congenial as possible, and start small with things so that people who are nervous or who are resistant can start to see some successes rather than trying to dive whole hog into a radical change.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that convince them with examples of your teaching and not with words about your teaching. You know, the Gandhi saying, be the change you want to see, right? Mm-hmm. So really promote what you're doing in your class. Share your successes with the other teachers. Have your students do activities that are using the language outside of the classroom so they can see how effective this teaching pedagogy is. And when they see the successes that you're having, and when they see your students enjoying learning a language because they're actually learning to use the language, they're going to want in on it as well. And they may even just start asking you about it.
Okay, thank you. Questions. We're going to wrap up here. If you're not signed up to our mailing list, please go to waysidepublishing.com and you can scroll to the bottom and sign up for our mailing list. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, so we hope that you will join us there as well. We also hope that you will consider attending the remainder of our webinar series. Session 2 about authentic resources will take place this Thursday at the same time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then later this month, June 25th and June 27th will be the 3rd and 4th sessions. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you then.